Welcome to the Daily Objective, episode more than 500. And today we are talking about the incident a few weeks ago when let's call it journalist for the Qatari dictatorship's propaganda network, Al Jazeera, was shot in a shootout between Israel and the Palestinians, some Palestinian terrorist organization. She was shot and killed. Um, there was some talk of an investigation. There is an investigation being done by the Palestinians. They refuse to let Israel take part in that. And there's, of course, the Palestinians immediately blamed Israel, as did some of their mouthpieces like Jeremy Corbyn, who almost became prime minister of this country, and some other particularly vile people around the world. But the point of that, the point of, as James and I were saying before we went live, and as I saw Robert allude to in the chat, it doesn't matter who actually pulled the trigger and shot the bullet that hit her. The people to blame are the Palestinians. There would be no violence in the Middle East between the Palestinians and Israel were it not for the Palestinians' choice to constantly have that violence. That is a Palestinian creation. They created it. They are keeping it alive, and they are to blame. Which is pretty much all I had to say for this episode. So luckily, I'm joined by James Valliant, who hopefully can fill the next 18 minutes with more on this topic.
Well, hi. You make a really good point. Journalists die all the time in war zones. Journalists have been shot and badly injured and even killed. A Fox film crew, for example, one person was shot and Benjamin Hall was badly injured. And that was not the only time in Ukraine where journalists have been shot or killed. And that's going to happen in a war zone. It happens all the time. And so the question, let me ask in the abstract, hypothetically, if a journalist were shot in Ukraine today, whose fault would it be? And would it matter whether it was a Ukrainian resistance bullet or a Russian invader bullet? It wouldn't to me. It would be Russia's responsibility. Russia is to blame for the violence in Ukraine. So every journalist who gets killed or shot in Ukraine, whether it's from a Ukrainian resistance fighter's bullet or a Russian missile or bullet, doesn't matter morally to the question. Journalists put themselves intentionally in order to cover these things in harm's way. You also point out a vital fact here. She was an Al Jazeera reporter. We all know the perspective of Al Jazeera. We all know their sympathies. She was a well-known, she's a female journalist. But even there, the idea that Israeli armed forces would be targeting journalists, which was immediately the accusation, it would seem to me would require a lot more evidence than we've yet had presented to us. And yet that's the assumption of so many of these vile voices, and it's international voices from across the world that are jumping in, as you point out, to take a side with a knee-jerk anti-Israel reaction, assuming, for example, that journalists would be targets of, the evil Israeli armed forces. Well, that's just an anti-Israeli knee-jerk reaction that as yet has no data to back it. Okay, let's find out where the bullet came from. Let's do an investigation even within the Israeli armed forces. But I find it improbable that the Israeli armed forces would be targeting a journalist. Of course, more recently was the outrage over the funeral. When her funeral was occurring, the more violence started, and it started from the procession. It started from the Palestinians who had a Palestinian flag on the hearse, and they were throwing rocks at cops, from what I understand.
Before we get to the funeral, I wanted to, I had another point about this, and I also wanted to read Robert's super chat because he's quoting, I believe this is Netanyahu, but I'm not sure. Robert, if you know who this quote comes from, let me know. If the Palestinians simply laid down their arms, there would be no more war. If the Israelis laid down their arms, there would be no more Israel, which is
brilliantly put.
True.
How pithy is that? Brilliantly put. That's exactly it. How, for decades now, the Palestinians could have had peace with Israel. They refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist. They demand on wiping Israel off the map, along with their Iranian supporters and suppliers and so forth. They could have had peace decades ago. They continue the violence. It's insane. At this point, frankly, as I've said to you on more than one occasion, given the amount of violence that continues to come against innocent Israelis all the time from Gaza, which could have had peace decades ago, it seems to me Israel could flatten Gaza perfectly morally, in my view. I know this happened on the West Bank, and even there, it seems to me that the Israelis are the ones who, as you point out, Robert, so eloquently, if the Israelis stopped using force, Israel would be no more. Israel would be no more. The Palestinians could stop using force and they could have peace tomorrow, and that would increase, they could have prosperity, they would have trade, their friends would come in and help them. But no, the condition, the humanitarian condition that these international voices are constantly complaining about is the Palestinians' own fault.
Yeah, by the way, Robert is an eloquent guy, but this quote is, as he confirms, from Netanyahu. So he can't take the credit for the quote. He can take the credit for the super chat, which is just as important, if not more.
Okay.
Yeah,
the eloquence of Netanyahu. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if Netanyahu was only as good a leader as he was a speaker, then also there might be no more war. You made a point about, journalists put themselves in harm's way, which of course is true, especially in war. But Palestinians put journalists and civilians in harm's way.
Children, women and children in harm's way as covers.
Actually, with the Palestinians actually benefit in a way from deaths of innocents, because the way the West is, we and by we I mean the popular views in the culture, tend to side with the underdog no matter what. And if you show that children and women have died, and if you show that a building, an apartment building, was flattened, then the context doesn't matter. It's, Leonard Peikoff once said, a picture is not an argument. Well, in public discourse today, only a picture is an argument.
Only a picture is an argument. Show me the picture of the dead body, as if that answers the moral question, which it does not by any means. And the worst thing is that we know they use civilians as shields. They use hospitals and residential areas to shield their violent activity, to shield their weapons, to shield their terrorist leaders. We know that. So again, not only is the wider context of violence the fault of the Palestinians and their friends, but even in the specific cases of civilians getting harmed, they are using their own civilians for this international PR war. Obviously.
And a great example of that, after the issue with the journalist being shot, which, to their credit, if we can say that, I think, people mainstream kind of realized we don't actually know who shot the journalist. It's not that much to their credit, because nobody made the point that it doesn't matter who shot her. But and again, the Jeremy Corbyns of the world will side with the Palestinians and with any of the worst people on the planet, no matter what. But I think in mainstream it was not as one-sided. But after the funeral, it was very one-sided, and
change.
We were
the whole perspective in the American press on it too.
Yeah, and the American president, and we were quoting Peikoff. We can also quote Rand when we talk about a selective recreation of reality. I mean, I think that that one video from the funeral where you do see Israeli police beating up the pallbearers, that's all the world saw. I went on a little rant about some journalist on Twitter. You can follow me at Razi Ginzberg and see me. That was Soledad O'Brien, who was, I remember her as not so good, but this was particularly alarming. The fact that people get away with looking at this short clip and basically knowing all they need to know. The evil Israelis are beating up the innocent Palestinians as they're carrying a body of a journalist who was shot. And it's
my understanding is there's really no dispute that it was the funeral processioners who started the violence by throwing rocks at the police, who were simply there to maintain peace and order, initially at least. So the violence started, and the police responded with batons. They didn't respond with deadly force. They responded with batons. Now, you're right. There's this clip, and it's, talk about an appeal to emotion, right? One of the pallbearers falls, it looks like he's being hit with a baton. He falls. The coffin looks like it's almost going to hit the ground. Oh, what disrespect. And then it looks like a Palestinian flag is being ripped off the hearse. That one little clip, I think, has done more to shape people's attitudes than anything else, without putting it into the wider context. It is the procession, it is the funeral procession that initiated the force and the violence by throwing rocks at the police. The context was already there. They were convinced that this Al Jazeera journalist had been intentionally targeted. And of course, we all know about the evil Israeli government. So in their mind, that's all that they needed to do. I mean, just this funeral was enough to justify throwing rocks at cops. In my country, there's a similar sort of narrative that goes on when there's police violence. The press and a lot of people on the left will immediately, in a knee-jerk reaction, before any of the facts come out, they will focus on one little aspect of it and see police brutality, police excessive force. And of course, if there is an idea of police excessive force, it's racism. If they can possibly say racism, they can say racism even if there's no evidence. And long before facts come out, and many, many times, I'm not saying there isn't police excessive force, there is, there's no question about it, but it's grossly exaggerated. But every time a new story comes out, boom, that's the instant knee-jerk reaction. We know it was excessive force by the police. We know it was racism. People should wait. People should wait to find the facts. People should calm down, and rather than make assumptions, especially when they're dramatic assumptions that can lead to more mob violence, they should calm down and they should wait for the facts. It seems, as I say, somewhat bizarre and unlikely to me that the Israeli armed forces would even target a journalist. But as we said, the very first point we made, the violence as such is the responsibility of all this violence is the result of the Palestinians' own doing, frankly. And even when it comes to that funeral procession, I want to know what was going on at that moment, before and after, and I want the wider context. And until we have that investigation completed, and frankly, I'm going to trust the Israeli investigation more than I'm going to trust the Palestinian investigation. I guess that's a dead giveaway as to who I think is more credible on this topic, if only marginally so. But the point is that I just find it bizarre. The immediate assumption is, yes, the Israelis targeted this journalist. And yes, of course, they wanted to go out of their way to attack a pallbearer who was holding a coffin so that they could create this PR nightmare for Israel. No, that just doesn't make sense to me. And so I think we all need to take a deep breath and wait for the investigation.
And as mentioned, like there is more facts. There are more facts out there that we know just from the videos. We do have other videos of the Palestinians attacking the police, but yeah, the facts do get in the way generally, not just in this case, of the so-called Palestinian cause. So the fact that they're not super pro-facts is not surprising. A few things from the members in the chat. So Bonnie says that in Dearborn, Michigan, Instagram headline, it said, "American reporting for Al Jazeera killed by Israeli soldiers," with no proof whatsoever, of course, because proof wasn't possible at this point. This is from the 11th of May.
Wow.
Yeah, and Robert.
The assumption is automatically the Israelis are the ones who did it, and with the implication they were targeting her. That's insane. I mean, ridiculous. Good point, Bonnie.
Yeah, and Robert points out that it's the most densely Arab American populated city in the U.S. So from what I know, and this is it's not much, but from what I know about the Arab American population, they are not, at least historically, we're not anti-Israel. Like, for example, the Arab population in Europe. So I think it is very much, generally speaking, the Arab immigrants in the U.S. are people who came to the U.S. to make their lives better and realize it's a better place.
Yes, I have known lots of Arab Muslims in this country and who are wonderful people. I mean, I have nothing, obviously I think they're wrong about their religion, my opinion about religion in general. But you're right. I think that American immigration sort of selects and sort of filters out for the better ones. In most cases, there are cases where I am concerned about the people we sometimes let in without doing. I mean, I'm in favor of open immigration, generally speaking, but I think the U.S. government has every right to screen for terrorists, unsuspected terrorists, and I'm not sure that we always do that.
Daniel also points out a headline that he just saw in The Onion. Nation demands everything will be explained in one picture. I think that demand has generally been met. Christopher says in the regular chat, my theory for Israel in terms of PR is to show the world what's going on. Cameras on IDF soldiers. It'll get messy, but people will see quickly, in my opinion. I disagree with that. I think the problem is not so much knowing what's going on. It is the philosophy that is underlying everything. So again, pictures exist and videos exist that show the Israeli side of things. You can be selective with pictures and videos that you choose to believe, and that your selection will be based on your metaphysical value judgments.
That's it. I think you're absolutely right. The wider philosophical issue actually decides this, and pictures, I think, can be misused badly, as you know. But one thing I will give, one corner I'll give him on that is that in Western media, when violence happens against Israel, against Israeli civilians, that does not get covered the same way that violence of this kind is. And it's just not fair. It's a very one-sided sort of presentation frankly, in international media of, we don't focus on the violence that, for example, that comes from Gaza routinely. And that's downplayed. You hear about it, but it's on page 18, or something like this, page 1. That is a reality too.
A couple of other things from the members chat, and yeah, I have to thank not only you, James, but the members, because I did say 2 minutes into the show that I have nothing more to say. So luckily, I can just read other people's words. So Robert says, "True, Razi. Most of my cousins in Dearborn, cousins in quotation mark, are perfectly reasonable. It's simply the math. A tiny percentage of a large population that gives us more radicals than most places." And Bonnie gives another headline from Dearborn. Video shows Israeli apartheid police interrupted the funeral procession of beloved Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh and began literally beating the people. Is that like a newspaper, or is that somebody on?
Well, the comparison to South African apartheid is bizarre. It is grossly unjust. It's, I'm sorry if I'm laughing at a grim situation, but think about that for a second. The South African government, in total charge of what was going on in South Africa, enforced racial apartheid for years. That is not what's going on in the West Bank or Gaza at all. The Palestinians could have had peace decades ago. And frankly, Israel is the one trying to seek peace with all of its neighbors, maybe a little too eagerly in my mind, but they're the ones trying to find peace in their region. To compare it to apartheid already, I mean, just from the outset, that tells you they're biased. That tells you they're not thinking objectively about this at all.
I want to make a couple of points. By the way, just one important note is this show is not sponsored by the Dearborn Tourism Board. So, if you've been convinced to go there on your next trip, that's on you. Um, Also, as you know, YouTube members who are active in the chat now, I see, and there are YouTube members who might watch this later. As you know, we've launched a Discord channel, I believe it's called, and every video has its own conversation. I need to get, I need to learn the Discord terminology. I haven't yet, but yeah, you can discuss this show and any show on this channel on Discord in its own thread. And of course, that is if you are a member of the YouTube channel, or if you are an ARCUK member at the gold level or above. Next Tuesday, so today we have the London Ayn Rand meetup starting in 39 minutes here in London, but next Tuesday in London, we will have an in-person launch party for the Fountainhead Book Club, which launched yesterday. And we had a 2-hour discussion yesterday. We'll have another 2-hour discussion, hybrid discussion next Tuesday. That's 4 hours to discuss just chapter 1. We tried to calculate, I think if we go at this pace, it'll take us nearly 2.5 years to go through the Fountainhead, but I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with that too. Every second would be worth it.
Yeah, and we had Shoshana Milgram and Lisa Van Dam yesterday. They will be there from time to time, not every week. Other objectivist intellectuals will be there from time to time. And it's, by the way, if you're a member and you weren't there yesterday, you have access to that video. If you're a YouTube member, you also have or will have access to that video, but not for every video going forward. So you have to already have, I'm told. But yeah, you will have to join to get access to the live sessions and to the recordings moving forward. Okay, we have a super chat from Mary Aline. Thanks for your comments and analysis. I'm pro-Israel, but I haven't kept up with this issue. Okay, we have more comments, which you can read in the live chat. I will say just that what we have coming up today is at 10 p.m. UK time, 5 Eastern. Cutting Edge with Lee Pearson and special guest Ed Thompson on educating education by making it conceptual. That's 10 p.m. UK time. And once that's over, around 11 UK time, 6 Eastern, there will be the Clubhouse after show of that show. So thank you, James, for joining me. And we'll see you again soon. Bye.